But where it gets really interesting is in some of these algorithms, the AI that you can feed all this stuff into, and it can start to synthesize it in a way that humans themselves wouldn't be able to do. I think that's the fear. And then you could make basically dossiers about all of us and all of our, most intimate habits and politics and who are we donating to and did we ever have a nervous breakdown. So much information can be put into the same place. And then on top of that, are we behaving in a new way? Are we doing something different? Are we changing our routine? Are we associating with someone we didn't associate with before? And it really does start to open this nightmarish prospect of being seen all the time and maybe not even being seen accurately, because another problem is that these programs make mistakes all the time.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Megan K. Stack to the show. Megan has been a foreign correspondent in China, Russia, Egypt, Iraq, Israel, Afghanistan, and the U.S.-Mexico border area. She covered the post-9/11 wars in Pakistan and Afghanistan and wrote a book, Every Man in This Village is a Liar, An Education in War. Her second book was about a very different kind of struggle. It's titled Women's Work, A Personal Reckoning with Labor, Motherhood, and Privilege, which I think I need to read as the father of two. Megan is a contributing opinion writer to the New York Times and recently published a piece there titled, Can We See Our Future in China's Cameras?, which is mostly what we'll talk about today. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Megan.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Before we get into America's future and China's cameras, let's talk about the China you lived in from, was it about 2010 to 2013?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so, I was there at the time as well. And how did you feel about the surveillance? Because you were a journalist. And at that time, or at least a few years previously, I used to joke that Western journalists in China were the last people still living in a Maoist state because you were followed everywhere. Phones were tapped, you had to regularly report to the foreign ministry and other such things. What were your recollections of the feeling of living in a country that already had a surveillance network, if not digital?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question for me because keep in mind, I didn't come from the U.S. to China. I came from most immediately, I had just been in Moscow. So I had been living for a few years prior to China in Russia as the bureau chief for an American newspaper. And so we lived in Russia under a very heavy-handed, open, I would say deliberately brutish kind of atmosphere of perpetual surveillance. We lived in a housing compound that was run by the government. All of our phone lines and internet lines ran through a mysterious office in the basement that no one would ever explain who the men were who were down there, monitoring everything that we did. People would come into our apartment when we were at home and leave significant files open on your computer or just move things around. There was such a heavy-handed need to let us know that we were being watched and kind of create this psychological atmosphere that some people really can handle better than others, I would say. So coming out of that and arriving in China, I felt actually, you might be surprised to know, a lot of lightness. I really appreciated the much more discreet, subtle Chinese approach. I was aware, I believed that I was being monitored probably more expertly and more thoroughly than I had been in Moscow, but no one wanted me to know about it. And no one was kind of pushing me around about it and sort of trying to make it feel like a threat. So it was such a cultural shift.
You never had the feeling that you'd get beaten up by the guy following you, even if you knew he was there?
Absolutely not. And compared to Russia, where you're definitely going to notice that guy following you, and he may even come up and say something significant just in case you haven't noticed. No one wants you to notice that you're being followed in China. So for me, I felt that I was being watched to the extent that I was interesting. But also, there was kind of a relief in the style it was being done, as ridiculous as that sounds. I didn't think the Chinese would ever hurt me physically. And with Russia, I felt like I was never quite sure.
You might actually get thrown out a window if you're not careful.
I didn't think I was going to get thrown out a window, but I had been called in to be interrogated. They were pushing me. They wanted me to hand notes over that I didn't want to hand over. And I was a little bit worried about ending up in jail.
Right.
And I didn't think I was going to end up in jail. It felt much easier and more manageable just on a basic human level. I felt much freer, which is kind of funny because I actually don't think the Russians are nearly as skilled or as technologically adept as the Chinese are at monitoring people. But I felt like I had been freed. And it's interesting. It's relevant to what we're talking about today. So much of this stuff is how does it make you feel?
Yeah.
Right? Like we're going to react to it if it feels bad.
Let's get into that a little bit, like take it up to date. So, I mean, of course, my joke about Western journalists being the last denizens of the Maoist state wasn't very funny after 2013, if it was ever funny, because Xi Jinping reined everything that had been freewheeling for the previous 2 decades, including the supervision or, sometimes expulsion of Western journalists. But the trip you described to China in the Times piece, so that's very recent. Can you point to a particular moment in that trip that made you realize how dramatically surveillance had expanded since your previous stay in China that ended in 2013?
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean to downplay. I think I was being a little bit dismissive of the surveillance in China. It was real. It was there. I remember actually being a bit impressed when we first came into China, when I first landed in Beijing for the first time. It was after the SARS situation had sort of changed things. And I remember the temperature scans at the airport. I remember walking in and getting my temperature taken by a machine.
Yeah.
And again, coming out of Russia and even to a certain extent the U.S., I was like, wow, this is crazy. It felt very on brand with this sort of Orientalist like stereotypes we have about Asia, that everything is way ahead and we're stepping into the future and, they're going to tell me if I have a temperature. So it was sort of that sort of thing. And of course, in terms of human surveillance, I felt like at the time, a lot of it was human. I felt like when you went into smaller areas or villages, someone would clock your car and immediately would know that a foreigner had come into the village. And, once you are starting to report, then you would just get physically followed around. And there was a lot of heavily watching people who were talking to you with a look of, and, kind of warning from some guy from the village, but who would be very nice to me and would sort of invite me to lunch or be very hospitable and very pleasant. So it felt at that time very human. People would come back. People I knew would come back from Xinjiang. I never made it to Xinjiang, and talk about just the incredible experience of seeing that many cameras and experiencing that much surveillance where every door had a camera on it and everything was filmed.
You're talking about 2010 to 2013.
Early on, yeah. Because that was sort of the early time. I feel like the cameras and stuff kind of had started in Western China, but we didn't see that at that time in Beijing like that. We didn't have cameras everywhere.
I mean, there were signs at that time, because I used to drive a car a lot around the countryside around Beijing to go hiking in the mountains. And sometime in, I think it was 2010, 2011, I suddenly started getting a lot of speeding fines. And I realized what the problem was that at the entrance, the sort of border of every village, the local cops had installed a bunch of surveillance cameras which would bust me speeding. And I think that was 2010, 2011, which is when I think they started installing the cameras in Xinjiang as well.
I mean, the other thing I remember, which is kind of funny, just moving around Beijing, there was like a semi-regular pattern of a foreigner would go out in Beijing and behave badly. And somebody would take a video of this interaction. Like, here's a foreigner being rude, being too aggressive, mistreating the Chinese. It would go viral on social media. And there was that sense of like, I remember feeling the pressure of, not that I go around abusing people, but I remember being conscious that if there were any disagreement in a public place, that those things often got filmed and kind of distributed. And so feeling that, but that was from people's phones, and that was sort of from citizen journalists and people just throwing things up on social media. There wasn't that. So, there was a vague sense of being filmed possibly, but not in an official way, not in a systematic way. It was just sort of like possible, right?
Okay, I'm going to haul you into this year. So your trip, you're on the
Tiananmen.
trip.
It was Tiananmen.
It was Tiananmen.
I saw it everywhere. Yeah. That was when I felt like, what is going on here?
So can you describe that?
Of course, as you know, Tiananmen Square is a very sensitive place in Chinese politics and Chinese society. And, when we lived there before, you could just wander onto it. I remember coming up out of the subway and you would just like walk across the square. I definitely left before all these kind of scanning points and sort of checkpoints and sort of to get into Tiananmen Square now, at least when we went this spring, it's very, I don't know what to say. It's like you feel that you're moving into a secure area. You're getting scanned. As a foreigner, you can't get onto it without your passport. You need your passport. Interestingly, I had to carry my passport all over the place in China this time because along with my face getting scanned a lot, your passport gets scanned a lot now, which is new. We didn't used to have our passports once we actually got into the country. Look, there were always a lot of cameras in Tiananmen Square. The cameras there weren't new, but there was something about the way that we were being moved and the sort of scanning that was going on, I think combined with just sort of the understanding of Tiananmen Square and how it exists in China that really struck me. But actually, there were a lot of moments. I mean, I didn't find the digital surveillance any better than the sort of cameras. And in some ways, it felt more invasive. I was really struck by having to use these cash apps, using like Chinese cash apps and really being unable to spend money without them. That was very new for me, not just in China, but just in life.
That struck you because it means that you can't spend a penny without it being tracked, or can you explain a little bit more?
Exactly. Well, I mean, it's something I'm always banging about, even in a US context. I'm a big believer in cash. I'm a big believer in cash as sort of something that should be maintained as, for civil liberties and for privacy and for freedom. I mean, I've thought about that for years. I get very agitated when stores and businesses will not accept cash. I sometimes think it should be illegal because the bills actually say this is legal tender. I don't know how it's possible not to accept them. So I'm already kind of like a bit of a radical about cash. So clearly when I got into a place where I literally could not use cash, I didn't like it very much.
Can I just ask on a practical note, was it relatively easy to use now? Because, there have been mixed reports about how easy it is for foreigners to access the...
No, and it was so interesting to me that China had done that because one of the ways that I think of China always is being very practical, very pragmatic, very efficient, and very much like always with an eye to the bottom line. I would never have believed that I would go to China and find it almost impossible to spend money. How does China allow this to happen when I feel like this is a country that culturally is good at business? I felt like when we were there before, there was a real eagerness for foreigners to come in. And there was, people were buying businesses with Chinese partners. Everywhere you went in whatever sort of city, anywhere, it seemed like the next table over, there would be a bunch of MBAs from like the University of Alabama or something. It felt like you couldn't get away from all the sort of Australians, Europeans, Americans pouring in to make money in China. And, it was open. It was easy. Everything felt very easy in the past. I would always laugh because we also moved from China to India where you really see an inefficient market and where it can be very difficult to buy things even when you want them. And even when the people selling them are like desperately in need of the profit, but you still somehow can't close that loop. In China, it always felt like whatever hour it is, if you need to buy some batteries, you're going to be able to find some batteries. Like someone is going to sell you the batteries. That is very much my memory. And now, as a foreigner,
you can buy the batteries, but you have to have the right app on your phone and you have to have connected it through some complicated...
So we were on a school trip. So it wasn't only my experience. I was watching all the other families from the U.S. who'd never been to China before, most of them kind of encountering this and trying to navigate it. And some of the banks were kind of freezing up because they were coming into contact with the cash apps in China and people were getting error messages. There were just a lot of instances where people just couldn't buy a bottle of water because technically cash is supposed to be accepted still in China, but in practice, I found a lot of people just won't take it. In fact, most people won't take it because, they'll say, I don't have change or just kind of like, no, I'm not going to take that. Here's my QR code.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it. That's how you're going to pay.
Yeah,
and so it is now. And I think for older Chinese people, I've read some stories about this. Like it's hard for some of the older Chinese people who are not as tech savvy to deal with this. And I think that's been a bit of a problem. But it is striking that you feel like in some ways, there has to be some trade-off of the volume of money being spent, especially when it comes to people coming in as tourists, for this complete visibility and sort of being able to see all the money that's being spent if you want to.
Yeah. So let me quote from your New York Times piece, right from the very beginning of it. You write, I heard some surprising refrains on my recent travels through China. Leave your bags here, a Chinese acquaintance or tour guide would suggest when I ducked off the streets into a public bathroom. Don't worry, they'd say, and shrug when I temporarily lost sight of my young son in the crowds. And the explanation is that nobody will do anything because of all the cameras. What do you think of the argument that the real benefits of this panopticon, because it ensures a safe society?
It does. I mean, it works. On that level, it works, which is in some ways what makes it so pernicious, because of course, to try to make this argument effectively, you're constantly having people come back and say, I have nothing to hide. I think it's worth it. Look, they don't speed on my road anymore. If a crime takes place, we're going to have a video. And because China does have so much more camera saturation, or perhaps a more efficient system to use the surveillance footage, I don't know. But, I saw the effects of it. I really felt that China had turned a bit similar to Singapore, which is another place that I lived for a while, where it was so safe and it was such a tamed society and so completely sort of full of government control that it kind of ran itself. There's no crime in Singapore is kind of a cliche. Of course, there's some crime in Singapore, but you could let your kids run free and not really think about it. China wasn't like that before. It was a little bit more spontaneous. It felt a little bit more rough and tumble. I mean, I was noticing so many things which were interesting to me. And I would love to know, I suspect that these things are also somehow tied back into the sense of being always watched. But I don't know. I don't have evidence for that. But the sort of habit that I remember as kind of a defining feature of Chinese streets, which was sort of men spitting on the ground. There's this constant spitting, and the government had tried to kind of end it in time for the Olympics, but hadn't really managed to get a handle on it. At some point about midway through this trip, I realized I hadn't seen anyone spit a single time. And I texted my husband. I was like, oh my God, I don't think people are spitting anymore. What has happened? I mean, it's funny, but there were a lot of sort of very proper social behaviors that I felt were new. And of course, they're positive. Like, it is good. No one wants to walk in puddles of spit. But I think what you have to think about when you start to make that calculation, and, which is very hard to get people to think about, is that it's all fine as long as you have absolute confidence in the people who are wielding that kind of control. And it's great as long as you think that they have so much respect for your rights, your freedom, your political dissent, your privacy. Well, obviously they don't have respect for your privacy, but that I guess that they wouldn't bring details of your personal life that might be picked up to bear on you if they wanted you to do something. And that your system of rights that you are counting on having is so fixed and so safe that you don't have to worry about a degradation of those rights as the years go by, and that you're so confident in the power structure that you're living under that you don't think there's any possibility that it may turn more sinister at some point. Like, it's fine as long as you really think the people who are doing it are completely fine and will forever be completely fine. But of course, that's not right. That doesn't exist.
So let's talk about the sinister aspect. Can you explain a little bit how the Chinese state uses predictive algorithms to suppress dissent?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think when we talk about this, a lot of people picture a very centralized system all being run out of like Beijing and Shanghai through the CCP and its various apparatuses. But it's not really like that. And interestingly, it's not dissimilar to what I see happening when I really dug into what's been happening in the U.S. with surveillance, in that there are a lot of different sort of parts of the state. There are a lot of different levels of the state. In other words, like different, like maybe city authorities or police in one particular place or the other, one province. So in these different areas, what you see is a lot of different arms of the state basically experimenting with the people. So contracting with a tech company for some kind of predictive software and using it in innovative ways. So you see things like, for example, people will have profiles in China that sort of indicate how likely they are to be politically problematic. Are they pensioners? I mean, not pensioners, are they petitioners? Have they already clashed with authorities or made some kind of complaint and shown themselves to be sort of discontented? Are they Uyghurs? Are they Tibetan? Have they posted politically problematic content on social media at some point that got flagged by one of the social media companies who are also monitoring content on behalf of the Chinese state. So if you tick one of these boxes, you can end up getting profiled as someone who is a problem. And at that point, you can have a lot of different issues start to arise. I mean, there's been documentation of, for example, if 3 people who are all considered to be problematic suddenly show up at the same geographic site, say it's like a restaurant, the police may show up because there's been sort of an alert through the kind of software, not because necessarily anyone who's sitting in the restaurant suddenly noticed that they're there, and that has sort of set off this response, not through human beings, but just through sort of like everything has been coded that way. Or, people trying to get onto the train to head toward Beijing. Well, you don't want politically provocative people showing up in Beijing because they might have a protest planned. And what are they coming for? Who are they coming to bother? What kind of scene are they going to make? And so people will just get pulled off of train platforms around the country to just physically prevent them from reaching the capital. I'm sure that there is far more happening than we even know, because most of what we know has come from reporting, which is either sourced by leaked documents, sometimes from some of the tech companies and the contracts they've signed, or groups like Human Rights Watch will document something and will get enough people where they're able to kind of put together a report of what's happened. But I don't think we have a full picture. And by the way, some of these, not the political dissent, I don't believe we have seen that in the U.S. yet. But, we do have things where different cities around the U.S. and different police departments around the U.S. have also contracted with different companies. And for a while, a lot of them were trying out these predictive policing softwares, and they were sort of also using them to put rankings on people who might be more likely to commit a crime. There's a lot of civil liberties problems with that. But again, until now has not been happening in like a centralized, grand, overarching way out of the Capitol. It's happening.
So that's what I want to talk about next. I mean, you quote Maya Wang, the human rights advocate, as saying the really powerful thing is when personal data gets integrated. So, and yesterday, NPR reported that the Trump administration, quoting, has for the first time built a searchable national citizenship data system that was developed rapidly without the public process, per NPR. So people are already worrying about what this could be used for. I don't know if this is connected to DOGE or is the same thing as DOGE. Let's talk about DOGE and data centralization. Why is data integration and centralization, why does that make surveillance exponentially more dangerous? And what do we know about the data that DOGE has in this new Trump administration database? Big questions, a bunch of questions. So just...
it is a big question. I mean...
answer any part of them.
Right. I mean, we have to say, first and foremost, now we're talking about the U.S. We're not talking about China. So we're talking here about the Bill of Rights. We're talking about the Privacy Act, certain protections that we do have, really not with our data privacy in particular. In fact, interesting point, by the letter of the law, the Chinese actually have better protections on their data privacy than we do because they actually have a law that's pretty good. We don't have any national or, sort of federal law that actually protects our data privacy. But, we do have enshrined rights, and we have a constitution, and we have a Bill of Rights and all these things. So we are theoretically more protected, and it is also illegal. Most legal analysts would say, and I would say, having read the laws in question, the federal government is not supposed to turn over our personal information to anyone. Government agencies are not supposed to give up our private information that they have gathered to anybody without our consent, including other federal agencies. And the importance of that, I feel, has been completely lost to our kind of internet and phone and app soaked brains that like you're actually supposed to have siloed information, and having siloed information is a great protection of an individual before a state. Instead we see the president himself writing executive orders that call for an end of information silos in the federal agencies, which really shows no awareness whatsoever of the legal history there. So that's one thing. You're not really supposed to mix up our data, especially when you're getting that data from government agencies. But we're in kind of a free-for-all at this point, and we can't say that it all started either with Trump and with DOGE and with Elon Musk, although they seem to have understood the opportunity that exists there and to have accelerated it. And also that is happening at a time when we're seeing abuses with the Trump administration that we haven't seen before. Like rounding up people who are here legally and sending them to a black hole prison in El Salvador, targeting people based on particular kinds of speech that should be protected. But somehow people are getting snatched off the streets by masked men because they wrote an op-ed in their college paper that the Trump administration happens not to like. And these kinds of things happening. I think it's the combination of an acceleration in our, what I would call a data grab. They're grabbing up our data. They're combining our data. They're talking openly about how they would like to combine our data. So let's talk about, I'm being vague, so let's talk about how it happens. Like we have Elon Musk come in with DOGE. DOGE is meant to be, right? Efficiency, cutting costs, saving taxpayer money. Great. Somehow that entails almost as soon as the DOGE teams get inside these agencies, they appear to start snatching up just huge troves of Americans' personal information and data. We do not know the full extent of what has been taken. We do know that Social Security data was taken, which is bad because that's a lot of our most private information and data. We don't know who has access to it. I don't believe we even know the full extent of what's been taken. There are agencies in our government that have our biometric data. There are agencies that have just, you name it, like so many things that most Americans don't even realize have been recorded and that they may not even be conscious of having given over to the government. The government will have somewhere in a lot of these data tranches that exist in agencies. Now, the importance of AI you asked about before, that comes in because basically, if you have a ton of information about all these Americans and it's just sitting in computers or it's sitting in, kind of storage online, you can't really do anything with it, right? Like the human brain can only do what the human brain can do. But where it gets really interesting is in some of these algorithms, the AI that you can kind of feed all this stuff into, and it can start to synthesize it in a way that humans themselves wouldn't be able to do. I think that's the fear. And then you could make basically dossiers about all of us and all of our most intimate habits and politics and who are we donating to and did we ever have a nervous breakdown? So much information can be put into the same place. And then on top of that, are we behaving in a new way? Are we doing something different? Are we changing our routine? Are we associating with someone we didn't associate with before? And it really does start to open this like nightmarish prospect of being seen all the time and maybe not even being seen accurately, because another problem is that these programs make mistakes all the time.
They make mistakes and hallucinate.
Dealing with certain kinds of information. So, it would be bad enough. I don't know actually what's worse, if it's perfect or if it's imperfect, but it's bad both ways and it causes problems in both directions.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember there was a time after I'd moved to the United States when some advertising algorithm decided I was a pregnant woman. And for a few months, I got served baby stuff and pregnant woman products. You can imagine the ramifications of, something connected with pregnancy going wrong in the South, at least where I live, where the laws against abortion and, women just looking after themselves are getting harsher all the time. So, who should we be most scared of? Elon Musk, Peter Thiel and Palantir, Donald Trump, Stephen Miller. If we have to worry, who should we worry about most?
I don't like to be scared of people. I don't like to be scared of Trump. I think...
So, okay, let me rephrase that. Who should we be most concerned about and do things about?
I think at this point, if we could even get Americans to start to understand that there's any value in trying to prevent any of these things from happening. I've talked to a lot of people just socially coming back from this China trip and sort of researching and digging more and more into these questions of the surveillance state. And what you hear generally from people is that they have nothing to hide. They see that there's a huge benefit to it. And people are sort of dismissive, like it's not an issue. Or they'll say, well, I know it's bad, but what can we do? We're all kind of stuck. We've all already consented to all these apps and, they've got all of our stuff, I'm sure, but oh, well, at least I don't have anything to hide. I guess that's more the attitude. So I think that right now something very sinister may be happening. I do think that I see a lot of data points in the Trump administration in particular that are ominous. I think that his effort or his administration's effort to shut down every state's right to regulate AI as part of this big, beautiful bill that they're trying to get through Congress right now. I don't understand how there isn't a sinister intent behind that. I don't see any innocuous reason that you would have that. The reality is, the federal government has struggled to get itself together on things like data privacy, closing loopholes for data brokers. But if you talk to people who really are invested in this and who full-time study it, they will always mention states as what they call the laboratory. So you can look around the country and see any number of states and cities that have tried to move where the federal government hasn't. I mean, I would say that's true generally, but especially with some of the surveillance issues that come up and some of the data issues that come up. And I think some of those states and some of those cities have provided a kind of model for what could possibly be done on a federal level. I don't understand why, when there is this kind of very healthy local government action taking place around this big new issue that none of us really exactly knows how to grapple with, your reaction to that as the president would be to say, you can't touch it anymore. This AI is not for you. You can't regulate it whatsoever. I mean,
so tease that out. The thread is that Trump wants carte blanche to use AI.
Well, I think it's mostly that I would imagine what I would interpret that as is that the administration is not so much necessarily having a grand plan about what they want to do with AI, but they do not want any pesky state governments getting in their way, whatever they decide they want to do, or whatever some of their sort of tech allies decide that they want to try. They don't want to be impeded by the states, which is problematic on many basic sort of how America is supposed to work levels as well. And the irony of Republicans being the party of states' rights and all the rest of it, it just has become a bit laughable recently. But I think that's ominous. I think that these contracts for Palantir, which have been very poorly and shoddily explained to the public, we know that there's some sort of a deal that Palantir is going to be responsible for, has been hired, in fact, by our federal government to create some kind of, there have been different reports, and I've seen Palantir pushing back on some of the reports, which has left me with a fuzzy sense of what exactly they're trying to do, which I think, again, is probably deliberate. But it definitely has to do with combining all our data, seems to have to do with immigration. It seems to have to do with pulling down the barriers that are supposed to keep the different agencies from sharing information. And we already have lost a lot of ground in these areas since September 11th as Americans. And I think that we're seeing, and I think we are living through the next phase of this radical and kind of rapid change that we don't fully see as it's happening. But then we're going to look back and realize that we've lost a huge amount of ground in terms of our civil liberties, in terms of our privacy before the state, which is important. It is important to have privacy before the state in this country, and we are losing it very quickly. I think Palantir, I would imagine that their initial focus is going to be immigration. I think that the most useful thing that they're seeing that they can do with all of this stuff, the predictive softwares, the data, the sort of loss of data silos, I think that all has to do with kicking people out of the country. I think we should take that very seriously. First of all, I think what has already happened with our immigration rights and the sort of targeting of people who have never broken the law, who've been here for decades, people who are here legally, and just grabbing them and kicking them out of the country. Some citizens have been pulled into that, supposedly by accident, but we have to remember that Trump himself said that he would like to start deporting U.S. citizens. I don't think that's a joke. I think he means it. I think the only question is the extent to which he may be able to be controlled by his lawyers or the courts or, cooler heads administration who feel like maybe it's not popular. But if unrestrained, I don't think we have any reason to think that he wouldn't like to start kicking U.S. citizens out of the country, deporting us. We've lost birthright citizenship. I mean, these changes, as an American, born and raised, the things that have happened in my own lifetime in terms of things that we thought were forever, that I, as a person in my generation, when I'm thinking of Roe v. Wade, I'm thinking of birthright citizenship. These were things that I think most people thought of as sort of permanent.
In your piece, you say the rights you thought of as inalienable can prove perishable, which I thought was a nice way of putting it. Yeah. I mean, it is pretty scary. I don't know if you saw that this so-called big, beautiful bill, if it passes, from my understanding, ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, which seems to be comprised of thugs who don't have proper uniforms or identification.
I mean, that is a whole other civil liberties issue. And what are they doing?
Right. So they're going to get $45 billion for detention, $14.4 billion for transportation and removal, on top of the current annual budget of $750 million, and $8 billion for hiring and retention. So, they're going to get almost, the better part of $100 billion. So if that actually happens, they will need new targets because they're going to run out of immigrants and naturalized citizens to persecute soon. So then I guess the next on the bill is, dissidents or journalists or decadent artists or trans people.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to think that we still have, sufficient protections in place that it wouldn't come to that. But, I also think just the fact that we're having the conversation is not great. This would be when I was maybe 10 or 15, this would have been like completely Looney Tunes conversation, that we would have been a couple of people in like tinfoil hats even to be talking about these things. So you see this sort of social drift and the sort of us sort of having to learn to accept more and more because so many things have already happened. I just want to make one more point though about the administration. I think one of the things that we do badly in this country is that we tend to ascribe to particular administrations certain behaviors that often are actually found throughout the continuity of the administrations, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. So I still believe, I hope, that we are going to emerge from this presidential era. Somebody else will come into office. I'm not ready to get rid of the expectation that we're going to continue to have elections every 4 years and new presidents. I think that's probably still going to happen. So let's just exist in the reality where that is a reality for a moment. But the reality is that a lot of these things have been happening that we're talking about, the surveillance, the sort of the gathering of the data, the sort of police and law enforcement buying your private information from data brokers. That has been happening long before Trump. And I think there is a risk that we are talking about these things now because of the administration. What I would hate to see would be for Trump to leave office and then everyone just to kind of say, oh, okay, well, the threat is gone, so we don't have to pay attention anymore. The reality is that's not true at all. It is going to remain a problem whether Trump stays or goes.
So what should the average citizen do to fight against this?
I mean, you can do a radical. There are some apps that are better than others. You can, on your own personal level, you can make changes to help reduce the amount of data that you're giving up. You're never going to stop giving up data, though. And the reality is, the short answer is they should support state legislation and hopefully federal legislation for as long as it's possible and encourage their elected representatives to make better laws. I mean, the good news is there are some fantastic organizations that work on these issues, and there are tons of proposals. It's not one of those issues where no one knows what to do about it. There actually are a lot of really good, solid legal proposals. People can go and look them up. Things like closing the data broker loopholes, things like getting rid of predictive policing because it's very problematic. There are specific things that are suggested. We can support those. We can encourage our lawmakers to support them. But I also think people should realize, I think a lot of people have guilt about this issue and feel that they have sort of colluded in their own loss of privacy because we're all constantly having to consent to these apps and nobody reads the deals. And the reality is, when you talk to a lot of legal experts, they will talk about meaningful consent. A lot of situations that we come into now as Americans, there is no way to meaningfully consent to the apps because yes, you can say that you're not consenting to participate in the third party, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know, maybe that's the only way you can get your kid's x-ray from the clinic, or maybe that's the only way that you can sign up for the softball game. I mean, we're just barraged with all these apps that we functionally need to consent to. And everyone knows that. I think that the changes are going to have to be more on a systemic level and more on a legislative level because you can control your privacy more. You can sort of move. People have written, guides about how to sort of move off the grid more, but not lose the internet, for example. It's a little bit inconvenient. It's not super easy because most people are not doing that. But realistically, to make meaningful change, we need better laws. We need better laws. And now we're in a situation where we don't even really have the transparency or the visibility to know what's happening in the federal level. So what do we do about that? I don't know. We demand it. We ask for it. We talk about it. We write about it. We do what we can. We ask again. We lean on our lawmakers, but they have a lot of stuff to do right now and they don't seem to be doing a lot of it. So I don't know.
That's kind of a mixed message you're leaving me with there. But I guess, the answer is resist in small ways as much as you can and try not to get depressed, if I had to summarize what you just said.
You have to accept that you can do everything that you can possibly do and that you can't do everything, and none of us can. And so, we need to work together. We need to talk and communicate and keep up the good fight and keep the faith. I think that is very important. When you look at resistance models, it's very important not to lose faith and to remain hopeful. I am actually a big believer in that. Like, I've thought about that a lot politically in different places I've covered and the importance of that and how even your sort of emotional state can be kind of an act of resistance, as silly as that may sound. I think it's true.
Right. Defeat them with joy.
Well, no, it's not that. It's not like a hippie thing, but it's just like when you give up and you fall into like permanent despair, it's over.
You're no good for anybody. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're not going to do anything. So,
Okay. I think that's a good note, Megan, to end this. So do not fall into permanent despair.
Yeah.
That's all
we
right.
only allow temporary panic.
Temporary panic.
Yeah. And you have to resume your normal good spirits.
All right. The Rhyme and Chaos podcast is produced by Maria Repnikova and me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review. And if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymeandchaos.com. Thank you so much, Megan.
Thanks for having me.